Rose, Roebuck, Walton, Roebuck Walton.
Okay, thank you. Would you start by telling when your family came to this area, the Roebucks, when they came?
My grandfather and grandmother Roebuck brought their family here in 1907 from Passenger, Florida, over on the Kissimmee River. There were 7 children, and 4 of them were teenagers. And I think the oldest one was about 20 years old. And my father was born in 1988, and this was 1907, so that's 19 years old, my father was.
So it was 1888.
And the family moved from Passenger over here and settled in Tropical Farms area.
Okay. So your father was born in what year?
1888.
Okay.
In North Florida, in Jennings, Florida.
Okay. And where was their home located here?
In the Tropical Farms area.
Can you describe that?
It was a 2-story house. It had been built by Reuben Carlton of Fort Pierce. And my grandfather had come over and looked at the property and bought it from Mr. Carlton. But it was the only home in this area at the time.
So that's really not that far from South Fork, is it, from this area?
No. The South Fork is about probably 2 miles from this. It was, at the time, of course, it was just wagon tracks on the Indiantown Road, but it was about the way the road wound around, the wagon tracks wound around, go around ponds and things, you know, back then. It was probably about a 12-mile drive from Stewart out to where they lived.
Do you know why they decided to come further east from Basinger?
Well, the railroad had gone into Okeechobee, which was called by another name back then, and people were coming into Fort Pierce for most of their supplies and things across it was a 3-day trip from Okeechobee and Basinger over to Fort Pierce at that time. Took quite a while to get there and then get back home. And my grandmother had decided that she would like to move further over near the coast. And they moved and brought all their household goods in wagons and settled in their new home out in Tropical Farms.
Did they have a name for that home?
Hope, Hope. My grandmother named it Hope.
So do you think that had special significance to her?
I think so.
Okay.
It was the nicest home they'd had, and such a large family, she needed the space.
We have a photograph of that home, so will you describe it?
It was a wooden 2-story house with, I'm sure there was more than one fireplace, because, you know, that's the only way they had of heating their homes back then was they practically had a fireplace in every room.
Okay, and what did he do for a living?
My grandfather farmed. Before he came here, he had a boat on the Kissimmee River, and he went back and forth to Kissimmee and brought supplies and had a store. He was a storekeeper in Passenger. And he sold things to people along the river front, Kissimmee River. And we'd bring things for them. If he'd stop and take an order from them, he'd bring things back to them from Kissimmee. But at that time, that part of the county was in the same county. Kissimmee was the county seat. And you had to go up there to vote, or you had to go there to buy supplies, and it was a long trip. But the 3 steamers a week that went up and down the Kissimmee River even carried passengers. They would bring, you could ride up there on the boat. And my grandfather, while he lived in Passenger, which we figure was about 12 years, he had 3 different boats that he ran on the river and also operated a store in Passenger.
Okay, what is of particular interest is why these boys who lived on this farm went on to have a higher education. Can you talk a little about that and what they did later?
Well, I don't think the boys ever intended to stay and farm, and especially they wanted an education. There was no high school in Stewart at the time. They only went through an elementary school, and the only schooling they'd had been what was available in Passenger. I think my father was about 7 years old when they moved to Passenger, and that's about all the schooling they'd had. And my Uncle Ray, the oldest Roebuck boy, was working in a clerk's office in West Palm Beach, and he decided offhand that he wanted to go to law school. He saw all the lawyers that he was helping in the clerk's office, and he went home and told his wife one day, "Mert, I'm going to go to school." And she said, "Well, what are you planning on using for money?" He said, "I'm going to sell this house, and we're going to the land and go to Stetson Law School." And he did. Well, my father followed him up there in a short while. He had money that he had made from a crop of watermelons. And he said that was $1,500 that he started off to school with. And he went, and they took the younger boy, Errol, their brother, Errol, was a member of Ray's household. He went to DeLand with them to go to school because he was needed to high school. And so all 3 of the brothers were up there at one time, and they all graduated at Stetson.
I'm looking at this picture of the Roebuck family. Were there only 3 boys in the family?
The first son was a boy, and he died in infancy. His name was John. But there were 3 that were raised, and 4 girls.
And all 3 sons became lawyers?
Yes.
Okay. Now, your father, what did he do after he got out of law school?
He taught for a while in both the academy at Stetson. They had an academy there that people who had not finished their schooling could go to first and then go into the law school. And so it took him quite a while. He went there in 1913, and he graduated from the law school in 1918. And then he worked for the school as a teacher. He taught in the law school and the academy, and he traveled for Stetson to get students to come to Stetson, told them what the prices were and how they could find jobs and help themselves through school.
Tell me your father's full name.
Robert Roy Roebuck. And of course, he was senior. I later had a brother that was Robert Roy Roebuck, Jr.
Okay. When did he come back to Stewart and use his law?
I was born in 1920 in DeLand. Well, my father married a DeLand girl, and they met at the school when he was going to school. And I was born there in 1920, and when I was 2 years old, my father decided that he wanted to come back down here where his family was and practice law. And also the big real estate boom was beginning, and people were buying and selling property. And he came down, he opened a law office, and he also got a real estate license and got so worked up over all the real estate that was being handled that that's what he wanted to do. And he bought property over on, it's US 1 now, but at the time it was just, I think the name of it was Okeechobee Road going out to Palm City. And there was no bridge there then. If you got to Palm City, you had to go across the river on a ferry, you know.
What built some buildings?
He built a hotel and 3 apartment buildings on his property, and then I think he knew already that the US 1 that was going in 1927, after the bridge, we had a early concrete bridge that came across. It took a curve there and came right through his property. His hotel was on one side of the street and apartment houses were on the other side of US 1.
Now the hotel still stands, or what was once the hotel, and we have early pictures of it. Will you tell me some of the things it's been through the years and what it was first called?
It was called the Rob Roy Hotel when it opened in 1926. And my father also had his law office in the part of the lobby and his law school certificate on the wall in the lobby. He was very proud of that. Farm boy, went to school and got an education. And the hotel was sold after my mother and father were in an accident. And in 1945, I was the oldest living child at the time, and I sold the property to
I think one of the names was Rice, a Rice Hotel.
Well, they bought it from, we sold it to someone else.
Okay,
and then the Rices bought it, and they operated the restaurant and hotel. And at one time they had a grocery store in there where the lobby, hotel lobby used to be. And then later,
it was the Jake's restaurant in our era, I remember.
Yes,
and
Jake's.
It looks like it's being restored now to open again. It's been closed.
It's sold several times, but it's a very strong building. It was poured concrete, reinforced with steel, which was unusual at the time. But my father wanted to be sure that it was would stand heavy weather, because he knew about hurricanes and the sudden storms that we had here.
Okay. Describe more about the boom and about what happened at school and the age you were at the time, what it was like during that era when you first came to Stewart as a little girl.
Well, I was 2 years old, but I remember a lot of things about early Stewart. And we had quite a few paved streets and sidewalks. It wasn't as primitive as it was 10 or 15 years before that, but it was still part of Palm Beach County. And a lot of people in this area were getting worked up about the county. Palm Beach County, West Palm Beach and Palm Beach were getting a lot of improvements, and Little Stewart was just not getting very much, and they wanted to form a new county. And a lot of people went to Tallahassee, a lot of our businessmen, and talked with the governor, and they persuaded him to help them get this, form a new county. And it was became Martin County, and 1925. And my father was busy building his apartment houses, and he built the hotel in 1926. That came after the apartments. And we were living in the apartment house, and I remember a lot of things about it being built, running around while the men were hammering up the walls, and all. And my sister and I enjoyed watching all that. But even though my father was a lawyer and a real estate agent, he was always had his country boy ways. He always kept chickens and had a garden. And unfortunately, when he went away anywhere on a trip, we children had to go gather the eggs and feed the chickens. And it was quite a big experiment there along the Fraser Creek, that he had all this sugar cane growing and all kinds of things down there that he still enjoyed what he did when he was a youth,
So right next to the hotel, there was the element of the farm with the chicken and the sugar cane.
And Fraser Creek was not a bulkheaded creek like it is now. to start with. It was just, you just walked out in the water, and it just got deeper and deeper, you know. But after they bulkheaded the creek and pumped a lot of sand in there, my father just couldn't wait to plant a crop back in there, and all this
Rich soil, the muck and
what was in there, and he grew things like eggplants, and I can remember many things that he grew back there on the creek bank. And he always had an elderly colored man that helped him. His name was Alexander. Last name was Alexander. And we just liked him so much. He was to help take care of the children. We were running around there, and he watched us to see that we didn't fall in the creek, you know. But he was my father's helper in the garden, and he was a very nice old man. We liked him.
Did he live on the property, or?
No, he lived over in Little Dixie.
Okay. How did you get to school from that location where you
We
lived?
walked. When I started to school, my sister was several years ahead of me, my older sister, and my mother would say, "Watch out for Rose now." And my sister would walk so fast. She was up to 4th Street, which is now Ocean Boulevard, and across the railroad track before I could even get to the corner. She walked very fast. Everybody remembers her as a fast walker. She went tearing along. And she was my sister, and was supposed to take me to church and take me to school, but she quite often galloped away and left me waiting behind.
She didn't always watch after Rose?
My mother and father lost another child in 1918 in the big flu epidemic that happened all over the country after First World War I. Their little boy, their first little boy, that was between my sister Virginia and I, he died with pneumonia during the flu epidemic in DeLand. So when they came back to Stewart, there was just my sister Virginia and I. And my earliest memories and pictures are all with her, you know.
I guess so. Now, you have memories of the parade they had to celebrate the formation of Martin County. Will you tell me about that?
All the school children in all the schools in the county participated, and the little elementary school children were all dressed in paper costumes. And I can remember my mother making a hibiscus costume for me. I was a first grader, and we practiced for a couple of weeks ahead of time how to march. You know, had to know how to stay in line and what to do. And we had, I think there were 9 bands played in the parade, and we had lots of beautiful floats. And if I remember correctly, I think the float from Palm City won the best float. It was quite beautiful, and Palm City people were proud of that.
We have quite a few pictures of that parade, so
Yes.
It's good you have memories.
And at that time, the Lyric Theater that's there now in downtown Stewart was under construction. And on pictures that I have somewhere up on the top of the building, in the pictures of the parade getting that far, there's a note up there, Fred Walton, contractor. And that was my husband's father. He was a contractor that built the Lyric Theater and also built the Atlantic Court Apartments, which were back then were called L. Bittler, in the same year. Stewart really began to grow at that time. People were coming into Florida to buy property because there was such a real estate boom going on. And people were building homes, and there was a lot going on in Florida at that time. And then before the end of that decade, there was a big crash on the stock market, and a lot of people lost their property, and it was very sad, you know. But for a while, everything was very beautiful. The people thought that they'd hit pay dirt, and Florida was going to be a pie in the sky, you know.
So that was the boom time attitude.
Yes.
The memories of the hard times, what do you remember about
Well,
that?
in all of the decade of the 20s, I was a small child. And in the 30s, I was a teenager. And that was the times that we had, all of us, hardly anyone had money. Everybody was working at anything they could find. Even well-educated people took jobs in the grocery stores or whatever they could get, you know. The money was very scarce. You never went to the movies or spent a nickel that you didn't have to. You just, everything went to buy groceries or pay the light bill, or it was, I can remember the first job I had. I took care of a little boy. His parents lived, rented an apartment from my mother and father. And the father was a carpenter, I think. He went off to work early every morning, and she was a cook in a restaurant downtown. And they left their little boy with me. In the summertime, I took care of him and took him down to the restaurant where his mother worked. She put him in a high chair in the kitchen and fed him when it was mealtime. She fed her little one. And then I'd bring him back home, and I'd take him by the park and let him play, or wherever that I was going, I took the little boy with me. I made the tremendous sum of $1.50 a week.
$1.50 a week.
That was my first job.
And your age when you were doing that babysitting?
I must have been 12 or 13, something like that.
Hardly more than a child yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So how did your mother manage? What did she do?
Well, Mama managed all of the collecting the rents from the apartments, what people we had in there. During the worst days, we had a lot of people in the apartments that could not pay the rent, and they had nowhere to go. And a lot of people eventually moved away to somewhere else, and it still owed my mother a lot of money for rent. But Mama managed to pay the light bill. She was paying the light and water bills for the whole apartment house, whether the people could pay their rent or not. And we understood what was going on. My sister Virginia and I did room work in the hotel, and instead of having maids, you know, we were the maids, and did everything we could to help. And of course, my mother and father had 2 more children, a little boy born in 26 and my little sister in 1930. And I took care of them too. When I went anywhere, I usually had the little boy I took care of and my little brother and sister with me. So that was what I did most through that depression. But in the year of 1935, I went down to West Palm Beach to stay with my aunt, my father's sister, Josie, that married a Frazier in the Frazier family. And I went to Palm Beach High School because they had music, and I was interested in music. And they had a band, and they had a chorus, and I got in the choral group. And I also was very interested as a child in reading. I would go to the library there in Stewart and get out 6 books at a time. That's all you could take. And in a couple of days, I'd have all 6 of those books read and take them back. And I thought that I would like to write. You know, I was just interested in it. And they had journalism, a class in journalism in Palm Beach High. And so I graduated there in June 1936. And I got a job at the telephone company there and worked there until 1939. Of course, I was close to home. I could come home every weekend on the bus to where my family were still here. And I married a Stewart man in 1939 and worked for the telephone company a short while after that on the switchboard in Stewart. But after that, I think it was about 3 years before our first baby came, and I didn't work for the telephone company anymore after that.
Okay, so you came here as a little girl, and you've seen it good times, bad times. Can you just talk a little about the community itself?
Well, the community was growing all the time. I know when we were watching the post office arcade downtown being built and the stores that were built in the same building, the post office at that time was on the corner where the Stewart Drug was later. And the Stewart Drug was right in the middle of the block and the post office on the corner. And we went there to get our mail when I was very small. And then after the post office arcade was built, we still went there for many years to get our mail. It was not delivered until 1947, I think, before mail was delivered to houses and businesses. And when you went to the post office, and you'd see people you knew and stop and talk and visit, and going downtown was our main entertainment for the day, because you'd see people that you knew and enjoy visiting. And
Was your father still practicing law during?
somewhat, he did a few things like clear up titles and things like that. But in later years, being a landlord, his hotel and apartments and his garden and his chickens seemed to take all of his time. And at one time, during the hardest months of the Depression, he went back out to Roebuck Hammock, which was still owned by his father, and grew different things. I remember he grew green beans, and he had a big farm out there with growing sweet potatoes, and he would bring all those things in and sell them to the stores, or ship them from the freight depot, to places that. And my father liked to grow watermelons, and he would grow things to help us through those tough years, when the apartments and hotel weren't doing much. I remember many times that Virginia and I, my sister Virginia and I, would sit in the hotel lobby at night and rent rooms to people, and they paid $1 a night for a room. People would stop off of US 1 to get get a hotel room. $1 for a room.
Describe the amount of traffic that came on US 1 during those days.
It was very scarce. It opened in 1927, and it's nothing like traffic is now. It was just once in a while a car went by. It wasn't bad at all. But my father's little hotel there was the only hotel directly on US 1 at the time. The Stewart Hotel was up at just before you went across the bridge, but it faced on Old Dixie Highway, and the back end of it was on the new US 1, So when Daddy opened the hotel, his was the only one facing on US 1. So people coming from the south came to our hotel first, and we had some people that came to Stewart to work and all that would rent rooms by the week that stayed there all the time,
I see. Your husband and his profession, will we talk about that a little, because things were so simple as far as the numbers in our government in those days. And
Fred Walton had attended Gainesville, at Gainesville University of Florida. And when the hard times came and there was no money, 32 and 33, he came back to Stewart. He worked on the construction of the Roosevelt Bridge. Anything they could do, they did. And he also worked for Florida Power and Light on the trouble truck. And then when he worked for the city of Stewart, he worked 4 years as the night patrolman. And they called him the chief of police because he was the only policeman on duty. And then he was served as the fire chief from 1943 to 44. And I had to go back over to my parents' property that they owned, their hotel and apartments, and take charge of that. And I had a small baby. I had a little 10-month-old boy. And so Fred took the job as Stewart Water Company. He was the superintendent of the Stewart Water Company. And he kept that job for 27 years until he retired. And he saw it from when it was a one-man operation till in later years, as he kept adding workers. I think there were 19 people under his supervision in the water company at that time.
so that one man was him, right?
That one man He read the meters, he operated the plant, he put in the services, new service, disconnected anyone that left. He was a busy man. And every night, I know before we went to bed, he had to go over and see if everything was operating at the water plant, and then back home, so that it took care of itself at night, but he always had to check on the water plant.
And as policeman, he was the only policeman in the night shift.
I think on Saturday nights when there was a lot of people roaming around that might cause trouble, and especially in the area of Little Dixie where there might be trouble, the city manager would put on his gun belt and his star, and he would ride around with Fred at night on the route. They just rode around town all night long, checking and seeing that everything was in good shape.
Like a cruise.
No trouble. I did want to tell you about his dog. He had a nice dog named Buster. It was the dog he hunted with. It was a bird dog. And Buster just roamed all over town, but he would go in the police station and wait for Fred to come in with the car at midnight, and Fred checked all the stores in downtown Stuart to see if the front doors and back doors were locked at midnight, that somebody hadn't gone out and forgotten to lock up their store, And the dog would go on the route with him, and he'd stop at the store Fred was heading for, and when Fred got there and was checking the lock, Buster would go on to the next store and stand there and wait for him. Everybody in town knew Buster was the policeman's dog,
So we had a helper.
Yes.
And then the fire department, how many people were involved in that?
He was the only one that was paid. The others were volunteers. And I think if they came to a fire when the fire whistle blew, they could tell where it was. Did you know that they had on the wall, if it blew once, it was downtown. If it blew twice, it was somewhere else. And like 4 or 5, I think 5 times the whistle blew, it was out St. Lucie Estates or somewhere like that.
So they had a code.
They had a code, and the volunteers knew where to go without having to try to call. When we lived upstairs over the fire station, and when my baby was, little boy was, we moved there when he was 6 weeks old, and the fire whistle would frighten him terribly when it blew. It got so high and shrill, and he would bury his little head in my shoulder, and he was shaking because the fire whistle frightened him.
I guess so. Where was the fire station then?
It was right in the center of town. Where the fellowship hall is down there, where the people have their meetings, the Alcoholic Anonymous. Well, that was the city hall, and right behind that was the police station and the fire station. Okay. And we spent quite a while there when Fred was a policeman, and then when he was the fire chief. And then later, when I was taking charge of my mother and father's business, we lived at the apartment house.
Let's just say, since music was a big part of your life, maybe just say something about how that enriched lives and what you did with your music, and then we'll wind up.
Well, the children in Stuart, when I was little, they went to church a lot. I think we went to church 4 times on Sunday. Sunday school, church, Epworth League, and church on Sunday night. And then when you left the church on Sunday night, you went to the band concert down, and we had a little park in downtown Stuart. There was a band shell right across the street from the post office arcade, and everybody went. They could park their cars along the side or sit down in the park. That was before all those buildings were built in that area, built up later, so there's no opening in there. But at that time, there was a fairly large band concert there, place to have a band concert. And also they had political meetings, like if there was anyone coming to town that wanted to talk to everybody, they would have it in the Bandshell Park downtown. And that's the kind of things we did when we were children, was go to church a lot. And the only parties we had were things like the high school. At the end of the year, we'd have maybe a bus or a truck would take us all over to the beach, and we'd have a weenie roast and swim. But we didn't get to go to the beach very much. There was no way to get over there. And people didn't, in the hard times, people didn't drive their cars anywhere they didn't have to, you know. Their cars weren't used for pleasure like that. They were for businessmen who had to have their cars. And
With
Stuart,
your singing, how did you just use it in the church?
I sang in the choir, in the junior choir as a teenager. And then after I went to West Palm and came back here to live, I joined the adult choir in our church. And did I mention that the Methodist Church was the only church in Stuart in those early days?
No.
Our little pioneer church that was built downtown across from the, right close to where the bridge came across the river. There was the Presbyterians and the Baptists all came to our church. And they didn't start, I think, in the late 20s before the Baptist church was built. I believe it was built in 27. And the Episcopalians, of course, had a church on the hill in Jensen, All Saints, that they could drive up there or go by boat if they wanted to. But a lot of them came to our church until we got the little church on 3rd Street that became St. Mary's Episcopal Church. It was our original little pioneer church that was built down by the water, and it was moved to 3rd Street. And I can't tell you the year, but it seemed like it was maybe the middle 30s. They had church there. And then later it was, they built the big church out on that they occupy now on East Ocean.
So you're really talking about your church as the Methodist church.
Our church was the Methodist church. That was the only one beside a little Catholic church that was in Vesey Addition. And so the Catholics and the Methodists had a church here first. And I always enjoyed the singing, and we sang. I had several friends that were accompanists for me. One was Edna Cotant, and later years was Rebecca Keller. And they would include me in everything around in the schools and at weddings and funerals and different programs that I sang. And the first time that we ever sang the I'm sorry, but I can't name it right now.
The Easter program, cantata, or what?
Messiah.
The Messiah.
When we sang the Messiah, we sang it in our church. And it was during the war years when we had our director was away in the service, and we had a young Navy man that was stationed at Witham Field, and he had graduated from several music schools, and he came and coached us all, and we all bought our own music. I still have my copy of the Messiah that I bought back in those years, war years they were, and we sang the Messiah for Christmas, on Christmas Eve in our church, the first time that I know of that it was ever presented in Stuart. But I enjoyed all those things through the years, and I still sing in the Methodist choir, but I don't do solo work anymore.
Oh, nice. Let's just end by, we have this long picture of a lot of school children. Will you tell me about that photograph, and are you in it?
That was in the year 1926, I think, and it was when our school building there was new. It's now on the campus with Stuart Middle School, and it's used for offices for the building that we had there is used for school offices. And it also shows the picture of the Atlantic Court Apartments, which was back then was the L. Bittler and they were both new buildings that had just been completed in 1924 and 25. And this was after some kind of a program that we had at school that day, because there were some of the children were dressed in costumes. It looked like they might have been dressed for, like Martha Washington, or dressed for, what was it, Washington's birthday? 22nd of February. See, I can still think. Anyway, I think that's what it was at the end of the day after we'd had this program in the school building. And then they had all of this, the entire school of 1925-26 was in this picture, from high school right on down through the first grade. And I was sitting on the front row, a first grader. And it had the teachers and the superintendent of schools, and everybody connected with the school was there.
So that was everybody in that picture connected with the schools.
Of course, we did have at that time 2 or 3 schools around the county in elementary schools. I think there was one in Jensen and one in Port Salerno, one down in Gomez, and one in Indiantown. But this was the entire school for Stewart. Stewart High School it was then.
And elementary, everybody.
Yeah,
right.
The elementary were in little wooden buildings around the back of the school, you know, and that's where the elementary. And I started in the first grade in one of those little wooden buildings. And one of the Mrs. Lowrys was my first grade teacher. There were 2 Mrs. Lowrys that taught the first grade that year, but I didn't have a Mrs. Harris Lowry. I had the other Miss Lowry. And every time I would talk to Dora Lowry, the other first grade teacher, she would say, "I didn't get you in the first grade. The other Miss Lowry got you." She always made out like she loved all of her pupils so much, you know, and wanted to be loved by all. She was very, very wonderful lady.
Mrs. Lowry. And just looking back, do you feel like you missed much? Do you feel like it was a good place to grow up?
I think Stewart was a wonderful place to grow up in. And even though our school was not accredited for a long time, that's one of the reasons I wanted to go to West Palm Beach, to Palm Beach High School, hoping that I would find some way I could go to college and get more education. I think I would have liked to be a teacher or a writer or something important, you know. But the school was not accredited, but I remember many of my teachers that were wonderful people, and I still think about how they inspired us, you know, the ones that were really great, and our principals, you know, they were fine people.
Do you think it was good that we formed this new county from Palm Beach County and St. Lucie County? Do you think things would have been different? Can you say just the summary, or are you proud your father was instrumental in that formation of the county?
Yes, very much so. And I was very familiar with that building that had been the school building and then turned into the courthouse when Martin County was formed, because I went with my father holding his hand up to the courthouse, you know, for somebody had to take care of little Rosebud before she was able to go to school. So I went with my mother and father everywhere they went.
Okay, thank you, Rose.
You're welcome.